Welcome again to this panel. For those of you who were here earlier this morning, think of this as part two of a discussion where the previous panelists who were here, David Cameron, Donald Kaberuka, are now sitting in the front row. And we had a very good discussion this morning about how one should think about approaching the issue of supporting development in fragile states and why we needed to think about it differently from the way we've done it. And we missed this morning Jennifer Widener, who was going to be a panelist for that discussion, but Amtrak did not cooperate. But I'm really happy that she is here now and can join this discussion along with Charles Collins sitting next to her, who is currently the director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. And it's really nice that, Charles, your team's recent evaluation of the IMF's work in fragile states has come out at just about the same time as this report. And so it's very nice to be able to bring those two strands together to see how we go forward. Paul Collier is, of course, been involved as one of the academic directors of the team that has put together the Fragile States Commission's report. But more kind of going back well beyond that, Paul's work on fragile states has really helped a lot of us think through how best to deal with these issues. And Amat Al-Susra, sitting next to me, has been the policymaker and practitioner on these issues for a long time. She was, of course, a minister in Yemen, and I was saying to you, Ahmed, this morning that I remember you were the first female minister in Yemen, if I recall right. But then she was also an assistant secretary general at the UN, in the UNDP. And so we have very different perspectives here. And what I would like us to do is to go a little bit now into a more technical discussion of some of the trade-offs that we face, because I think this morning very nicely framed the big issues, and the question now becomes, how does one take that forward? I think the idea is that we get, Paul, you're going to lead off and say a few words about, from the perspective of the work that was done preparing for the commission, and then I think I might turn to you, Charles, to say a little bit about, you've looked at the history of the IMF. You've read probably now the report that the Commission did. It has some things to say, not just about the IMF, but about the IFIs more generally. And from your point of view, I'd really appreciate not just your perspective from the evaluation, but also how do you react to some of the points that are being made in the Commission's report? Are they sensible? Are they doable? Are they feasible? And then I think I'll come to Amit and to Jennifer. So we start with you, Paul.
Thank you. So just to pick up from where we left off, we're not looking at 20 years of success when we're looking at international policy towards state fragility. There's been an awful lot of resources spent, both money and security input, still an awful lot of fragility. And there are some very fragile zones that are sort of just on the edge, like the Sahel. So we're starting from a presumption that past approaches haven't been the best possible. How we see what's tended to happen in fragile states is that the international community comes in, imposes its own grand vision of what a successful state will look like. The grand vision is always pretty well the same. You know, we parody this as it's always going to look like Denmark. And then you say, if that's your vision, then you say, in what respects is it not like Denmark now? And you get a pretty long list. And that then becomes the agenda for action. So, for example, in South Sudan, one of the biggest donors What's one of the problems in South Sudan? They emit carbon. And so, sure enough, in the last few years in South Sudan, there was a carbon emissions reduction program, donor-financed. You know, if you don't find that funny, you've not understood the first thing about that you get these very, very ambitious, overloaded programs with no sense of sequence. You do everything in parallel. Now, the reality of fragile states is that there's not some root cause of conflict which just needs to be fixed and then you're off, Denmark beckons. The reality is that whatever caused the problem, you've now got a syndrome of interlocking symptoms. The state doesn't have legitimacy with its own citizens, and there is no magic quick fix to get it. Win an election? Oh, everybody sees it's a legitimate government? No, it works in Denmark, but it doesn't work in conditions of fragility, right? The people who lose an election, I very much like Donald's formulation of the permanent losers, just don't accept that whoever's won an election, which they think is cheating anyway, is the legitimate authority. So illegitimacy of government in the eyes of a lot of citizens. Insecurity, very low capacity, an absent private sector. Exposure to shocks, very low resilience. You know, these are the sort of syndrome of conditions that feed on each other. But let's focus on one of these things, very low state capacity. And that tells you, if you come with a diagnosis of these are all the respects in which you're not like Denmark now, Yemen, that's the challenge, you're going to so massively overload the program that it won't be implementable. And what then happens is failure. And I should say more failure, because these fragile states start from a long history of failure. Now here's a nice little social psychology result. If I ask you, how did your football team do last week? If it won, you'd probably say, we won. The interesting thing is, what would you say if your team had lost? And what social psychology finds is, you'd probably say, they lost. We won, they lost. People move towards an identity with success, away from an identity with failure. Fragile states, the public authorities have had failure, 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 all the way down. And so the vital thing is you stop that. You get to some success. Given very low capacity, the only successes are going to be pretty simple things. And they better be quick and visible successes, so that you start to get people saying, we did that, not they failed. Right? So that's the basis for the idea of quick, visible wins. Easy things that are within the capacity. And there won't be many of them because you don't overload. If you try and do 100 of them, they'll all fail, and then you're reinforcing the problem. So quick wins. That buys you time. What do you use that time for? Two things. You build, as David and Donald were saying, you're building a state that meaningfully works for ordinary people. And that has two components. There's what we can think of as a negative agenda, which is building checks and balances on the abuse of public office. So a negative agenda of gradually building checks and balances. And this is not tick box. This is not, you've got to have a free press and elections. It's whatever works within the society. Often the checks and balances will, for example, be internal to a ruling party. You know, how did ANC get rid of Zuma? You know? So it's whatever works, but they're effective checks and balances that gradually build trust, that citizens trust the government not to abuse its power. And then that's the negative agenda. As you build trust, you can then move to the positive agenda, which is purposive government. Government is there in fragile states to get its actions will get the society out of fragility by developing the economy. And that requires a phase of collective effort for a better future. You know, if we look for one reason why China developed, what one component of the Chinese miracle, they saved nearly half income. They postponed consumption. Now, and much of that was done through the state. People trusted the state enough to give it their savings through taxes and lending, and the state then was subject to enough internal checks and balances that it wasn't all embezzled, it was actually used to build a better future. That's the positive agenda of purposive government, which rests upon the trust achieved by the negative agenda. That process of building checks and balances and purposive government is a process of a decade, not 10 minutes. Right? What buys you the time for the decade process is the succession of simple, quick wins that gradually gets people to think in terms of teams of public officials delivering on their little mandate. Right? So, finally, has the bank and the fund been doing this? We had a panel yesterday at the Bank and the Fund with very senior bank and fund management saying, oh, you know, we're optimists and it's all wonderful and we're very happy and we are just carry on. No, right? Neither the bank nor the fund have been doing their job. The bank has no differentiated strategy for fragile states, and it doesn't even have an organizational capacity to deliver a distinctive strategy in fragile states. That's why the programs are so overloaded. The fund is the same thing, right? And the fund problems are even deeper, as we're about to hear.
All right, so Charles, now that you had the punchline set out for you for the hard work that you and your team have done for over a year, can you please fill in the blanks?
Fill in the gaps. Well, first of all, thanks so much to CGT for including us in this panel. It's really a great opportunity for us to talk, and I think indeed our messages complement very, very nicely what Paul was saying and what the Kaberuka report talks about. The fund is one of those institutions that has moved very quickly, has engaged intensively with fragile states for over 20 years. I would say there have been some success stories. Countries that have been able to move forward. Rwanda would be a good example. But there are many more countries that have not been able to move forward and have got stuck and sometimes even fallen backwards. So our evaluation recognizes the real contributions that the fund has made in terms of macroeconomic stabilization in many cases, in building very basic but key macroeconomic institutions like introducing a currency after a civil conflict, introducing a revenue authority that can collect money to start spending, introducing some degree of expenditure control, bringing in experts to help develop these institutions. And although the fund itself doesn't provide very much money, it does catalyze flows from donors. So when we go talk to fragile state officials, we did 16 case studies and talked to senior people, both current and former policymakers. They're generally pretty appreciative. Having said that, however, the fragile state problem, as you say, continues to be a major issue, not just for the countries themselves, but for the global agenda. The fund is always saying, of course, we are fully committed, but the problem is, as Paul was saying, that the fund's business model doesn't really fit the circumstances of fragile states. It's very difficult for fragile states to implement the consistent high-quality policies to access the fund's stamp of approval. So we found that 25% of fragile state programs with the fund went off track. The average for non-fragile states is 75%. So the fund is trying to apply high standards and is disappointed when the fragile states cannot consistently meet those high standards. Capacity development work. The fund ramped up its spending on fragile states, has done some good work, but the fund staff is increasingly concerned about the lack of efficiency of capacity development work. on fragile states, that you have 2 steps forward, but then a step backwards, and you worry about the absorptive capacity, you worry about the cost. There's a big problem of getting people to work on fragile states. And Masood, you're very aware of this as being former director of the Middle Eastern Department. We found that there's a stigma in the fund. The fund recruits these bright economists who love to work on Japan or on India or Brazil. They're not very excited about working in fragile states. It's not part of their DNA. So the teams tend to rotate very quickly. They tend to be understaffed. Typically, you get very good people leading, but the full team is not adequate. We heard from a senior fragile state official that often they felt they were doing technical assistance to the fund staff rather than the reverse, because you send some very junior person along, and they're very good on their econometrics, but less good on how do you raise revenues when you don't have an income tax. So there's a whole series of institutional problems. In our report, we come up with a number of suggested modifications to how the fund addresses fragile states, looking again at the architecture of fund financing facilities, being more prepared to provide on-the-ground follow-up support when you do technical assistance work, to have more consistency in support for these countries, to provide additional incentives for people to work on fragile states, and greater recognition for the value of this work to the institution. But in addition to that, we try to also recommend commitment devices to make sure that the fund truly delivers on its aspirations more consistently with greater energy. And that requires high-level commitment from management and senior staff across the institution. It's not enough for just the director of the Middle Eastern Department, the director of the African Department to plead for help. It needs to be full institution-wide support. So we made a broad range of pretty strong recommendations. We discussed it at the board. I'm glad to say that the board was, I thought, pretty responsive, recognizing the importance of this work and recognizing the validity of many of our concerns. Management also. I think the managing director appreciated the report, but the ball is now in their court. They have to deliver an implementation plan within the next 6 months. It's going to be difficult. There were certainly a range of opinions at the board on, for example, to what extent the fund should be modifying its lending practices to these countries. Should it be diluting its standards, the magic upper credit tranche conditionality to recognize the circumstances of these countries? It's not easy for an institution like the fund to adapt, but I think the reality is, if it's going to have its full impact, it does have to adapt.
Thank you very much. I think we'll come back to some of those points because I think you've raised 2 important points which I'd like us to come back to after we've got the other panelists. One of them is whether, in fact, the shareholders or the members of these institutions are willing to accept that the way in which those institutions need to engage in fragile states has to be fundamentally a different business model. And to what extent, as you said, in your discussion of your report, I can imagine that there were a lot of representatives of even major countries who would be very uneasy at the thought that somehow you would have a different, what you would call a standard. I would actually call it personally a different way of doing business, reflecting the circumstances of those countries. That's one question. And I think the second one that you've done, which is very nice for us to be reminded of, is that your evaluation actually did talk to 16, I think it was, countries, fragile states, and asked their policymakers, current and previous, as to how had they been served. So it's sort of getting their perspective. And I think you identified some things that the current system does well, with sort of well-defined tasks, introducing a currency, building up a revenue authority. But then there are all these issues which are more, how do you support longer-term development there, where I think what the officials are saying is that it's not obvious we've got a model right. And that's why I think it's a very nice segue, actually, to turn to Ahmed, because you've seen this not just from Yemen, Ahmed, but also from your regional perch, which you had in the UN. And so from where you sit, not just looking at the fund or the World Bank, but more broadly at the international system, including the UN system, how do you see now, in light of all the background discussions we've had, the agenda going forward and what works and what doesn't?
Thank you very much, Masoud, for this opportunity. Glad to be here. And I think it is important also to start from Yemen too.
Yes.
To arrive then at that global, scene. A year before the conflict, the current conflict erupted in Yemen, it could have been impossible for anyone to predict or to even imagine that Yemen was going to go this route, the very, very dangerous one, which we are still under. And it was exactly just 1 year before the conflict that Yemen has been announced as a model for political transition, as you know, in most of the Western capitals in particular, and in comparison as well to some of the countries which witnessed the winds of the Arab Spring. And it was clearly, everybody was moved and taken by it to the extent where even, I would say, the internal actors as well in Yemen, that is the government, the opposition, the civil society, you name it, everybody was really swiped by that really element. But the fact of the matter is that it was unclear and it was dangerous as well to keep thinking this is exactly the case, because the economy, in one hand, was already not just regressing, but it has arrived at a level of stagnation, a level of so many and several incidents of sabotage for the oil production, the insecurity incidents, some of the regional even clashes, which have been taking place simultaneously while we had this wonderful 650 people taken place in this national dialogue. Now, what happened was that also, not forget that back to the very local and basic unique cases, if you will, of any given country, including in the fragile situation, because not all fragile states are impacted by the elements of fragility the same way. Rather, it is also important to look at it from that very local lens. And in Yemen, as you know, the whole question of the donors' existence and the support, which has been very generous still, although the space was really limited. Like, we had a very small number of donors, but at the same time, they were very generous, and especially 50% of the entire aid was received actually by the Gulf countries, and namely by two major Gulf countries. Namely Saudi Arabia and then Kuwait, with the Emirates somehow in that regard. And the rest of the donors' money was coming from OECD countries and other donors, etc. But that was also another only, I would say, superficial, way of looking at it, because that was only on papers, because that was only the pledge. It was almost $10 billion by 2012, immediately in the first donor meeting which took place in Riyadh. And all the donor countries, including, of course, the immediate neighborhood, was so generous again, and they announced an extra also pledge to really helping Yemen go through the transition. But then nothing has changed in the way of the disbursement, in the way of the implementation, let alone looking at the capacity of the government, which was already very, very low, even prior to the transition. And then when the political transition started to stall, the first impact was felt actually at the level of the standard of the living, which was not great to start with, even before the transition. So what I mean is that you cannot look even at a small example of the impact of this whole sense of fragility in absence of looking at the entire dynamic, which was really taking place, but it was somehow underplayed, underestimated. And I guess also the government was so much busy with so many other urgent issues, including, and this is very important, this is again a lesson to be learned by the international donor community and the global development also community, and that is, it is no matter how you really genuinely want to establish and to assist and to help your partners in any given country, that has to be coming from within the national, essence of it, like from the government, from the components of the society, from also the real translation of the challenges of development that are really striking a given country. And Yemen was no exception, but that was not the case. In addition to that, as you know, politics, unfortunately, and at the same time, we know it's fact, it impacts every little decision. And that was the case during the transition in Yemen, because again, that government came, and the feeling was, we came because the younger men and women made it to the streets. The former president has finally agreed to leave power. And then we felt, those who really made it to the streets, felt they are really representatives of the calls of the people of Yemen. And so they formed, of course, that 50-50 kind of national consensus government. But the question of who was making the decision, especially the economic decision, was not clear. Please, I mean, I am, of course, now live, and I think many people are watching this, but that was really the essence of it. And the problems inside the structure of the government, which was transitional, which was based on political consensus more than anything else, and mostly, of course, the government, although with the exception of the economic team, but the rest of the ministers and the cabinet was political. Political in the sense that many of them had no idea or experience about how to running a government, not especially in those very difficult times. In addition to the fact that the money was not coming. Again, we go to the same vicious circle because you don't have really good capacity for the government. Even those units which have been invented, as you recall, even in the first reform program that was in cooperation with the bank, with the IMF, starting actually in the 1990s, not just the program which was announced in 2014, immediately after that transition. But even from that time, the kind of performance for those agencies could not, no matter how empowered they were, could not replace the real necessity for having a strategy that had to be executed by the national government, owned by it at least, and debated over it, and then also built its capacity on it. So these were all, to me, the underlying really reasons why, of course, the economy of Yemen has gone way beyond the expected, even negative, levels of development, of growth, etc., but which has led to a major part of it, of course, to the spread and to the beginning of the violence, which has been, of course, after that in a mega way, has become so terrible. Now, it's also easy to say now that we are a little bit far from 2014 when that program, the reform program, has been announced. But again, it was not the one and the only, which of course has led to that. Because on the other hand, one cannot but to continue to insist as well that it's also the prime responsibility of the national authorities as well to analyze, to evaluate, to follow, even if the situation was not so much conducive that it wouldn't allow them really to manage the businesses the way they were supposed to. But unfortunately as well, again, it was seen also by the government, with the exception of the idea of the so-called economic team in the government. But for the rest of the government, more or less they were saying, this is the money of the donors, and if they want to give it, it will be, when we are going to perform, then the donors will have really to help us in doing this. So the question of ownership goes beyond just, this political rhetoric thing. It's a major thing. And I fully really see that it is possible as well to fix it. Like, it's not impossible at all, even in a situation like when my beloved country has really arrived at, because it is also possible to establish, even during the most difficult time, a level of checks and balances and accountability mechanisms. And we still had so many institutions that kept working. It's not like that everything has collapsed and disappeared from existence. They were there. They needed also minimum, maybe help in some of them, but they were really to help. Now, I can say, opposite to all the others who might not want to admit to the losers, I think in Yemen's case, and I hope the previous government and the current government will forgive me for saying this, but I think it's a common knowledge too. I think we all failed in Yemen. We all failed in Yemen as government, as opposition, Yemeni opposition, as different components of the intelligentsia of Yemen, because for most, and to start with, this is a national responsibility. Yes, we can, of course, develop, we can improve in our relations with the international community, with the other institutions, but to start with, if we are really going to correct this particular and important partnership, it will have to be built on our own policies, intentions, political will, but also most importantly to work on results on achieving that. And I will stop here. Maybe if
thank
you'd
you
like
very
to,
much, Amma,
yeah.
because I think that's actually a very important point on
Yeah.
which to end that intervention, because I think the point that you're raising really is the primacy of both the responsibility but also authority that has to
Exactly.
come from the national side. And so I want to turn to Jennifer. You've sort of listened to this conversation. You're part of the commission itself that produced the report. I want to get a little bit your perspective on how you see now as a result of this. What would be your reaction to it? How would you, looking back to your report, is there anything you would say, maybe we should have done it differently?
That's an interesting angle to take. It's not what I'd expected to talk about. Apologies for the failure of American infrastructure this morning. I would have been here earlier. I would say if there are some hard problems that we wrestled with, and I think we're still wrestling with these. As Paul pointed out, and I think is implicit in the conversation, fragile states assume many different forms, and some are just much more difficult situations than others. Certainly where you have fragmented power, no limited central authority, fragmented power, the tactics that you can use to build performance legitimacy initially and to begin to secure the borders are very, very different than they would be in other settings. And I think we've wrestled with what you do in those contexts. And as somebody who runs a program that helps facilitate exchange of ideas among reform leaders, I'd say they all wrestle with this. So I think we did wrestle with some of that. There's tension between a lot of what we say and some of, I think, what we would all try to do. I mean, there's a temptation to go down certain roads regardless of, I think, what our fundamental realization of the difficulties are. So I think there's a line in there about how you handle anti-corruption work. And how to position this, and a rather strong statement about anti-corruption commissions maybe not being as useful as we think. But, it varies a lot, and it depends on the setting. So I think there are some differences there. I did want to emphasize something that may have come up in the first session, and certainly has run through some of the comments here, and that is, I think that early on the report also focused heavily on the value of performance legitimacy. And I raise this for two questions. As an academic, I know the academic evidence of this is mixed. I happen to think that it may have to do with the way we structure our reports. But performance legitimacy strikes me as extremely important, especially where you have fragmented authority. And it poses a special challenge because you have to deliver something quickly. So Idris Jalla in Malaysia says, big results fast. It's exactly what you want. That has taken a lot of different forms in a lot of different places. It doesn't take the form of first trying to build a meritocratic civil service. And I see repeatedly an effort to go down that road, and donors and academics both, using as metrics well, do they have a performance evaluation system? Hey, to do that, you have to have enormous levels of capacity to begin with. So we focus more on the signaling and the sequencing implicit in some big results fast, in teamwork to get those done, 100-day goals, 150-day goals, working with people who are already there, perhaps facilitated internally or with help from others, maybe the private sector, and focusing on things that people in the society value. Paul probably brought up the example of cleaning the mosques in Tunisia.
I think David Cameron did, yeah.
David Cameron did, okay. That would be one. My colleague Salam Fayed is fond of saying, hey, it was reducing smuggling in petrol supplies, because if you did that, petrol would be cheaper for others, you could launch businesses, so we needed to tackle that one. It could be cleaning up the garbage, but the signaling involved in that of showing, yeah, we can actually do something, terribly important. And it handles that difficult phase before you really have enough capacity or enough security in office to actually go down the road and build a more meritocratic society. But I think the interesting part of this discussion is going to be in the questions, so I'm going to stop there.
Well, I think the interesting part of the discussion would indeed have been in the questions. However, I have just been told that, in fact, our expectation of being able to put in questions before we end at 11 has been overtaken by the clock. And so what I would like to recommend is actually that we end this session now, but that we will have a chance outside for people who want to continue this conversation to do so. But I do know that some people are, some of the panelists have other things to go to, but others who can stay, we should just convene outside and have a informal conversation. But I'm sorry to say that we do have to bring this to closure now, because we have some tight deadline on this end. So thanks to the panelists. Sorry we haven't had a chance to involve the audience in this part of the conversation, but also thanks to all of you for coming to this event and to the one earlier this morning.